So when we're talking early childhood, we're talking kind of like 2 to 7 is sort of the age range we're looking at here. Last time with infants, we talked about how they have this very explosive exponential growth in those first couple of years. During early childhood, we're going to see that physical growth starts to slow down a little bit, but cognitive and neural growth is going to continue at a pretty explosive rate still. Some of the cognitive developments we'll talk about are improvements in things like attention, executive function, which is mostly our ability to kind of self-regulate, and also major improvements in language as well. We'll talk very briefly about the impact of technology, obviously much more present in early childhood life compared to what it has been in past generations. And there are, lots of ways that technology is helpful, but also can hinder development in some crucial ways, so we'll talk about that as well. So first, let's start with physical growth. Like I said, during this time, from around 2 to 7, that growth starts to slow down a little bit, but proportions are going to even out. So if you remember, last time we talked about kind of towards the end of toddlerhood, toddlers often have that sort of disproportionate larger head. Their trunk size is kind of larger compared to their limbs. But during this period from 2 to 7, that's going to start to even out. You're going to get more proportions that are more similar to what we start to see in adulthood. We also see lots of improvements in gross and fine motor skills. Remember, gross skills are those sort of large body movements, things like running, jumping, whereas fine motor skills often are using, really precise hand movements, things like drawing and writing. So we still continue to see lots of improvements in both gross and fine motor skills. A lot of that obviously is happening on the playground. Those gross and fine motor skills are going to improve the most for children who have lots of opportunity to practice them. So kids who tend to be more sedentary, who are spending more time indoors on their screens and stuff, are not going to advance at quite the same rate compared to children who are, again, getting lots of opportunity to play on playgrounds, to participate in sports, etc. We also start to see quite a bit of individual differences in gross and fine motor skills around this age. Up till 2, most people follow kind of a similar path, assuming that they're developing normally. But from 2 to 7, we just start to see these pretty large individual differences where some have advantages over others. In addition to kind of growth of the body overall, there's also some changes happening in skeletal growth. So if you remember, we talked about how toddlers tend to fall a lot, but they often avoid injury because their bones are still fairly flexible. But during this age of 2 to 7, the bones grow and they also kind of start to harden more towards the end of that early childhood period. So their bones are lengthening. They also develop these new growth sites, kind of the center of mass where the bone starts to grow from. It's also during this time that they will typically start to lose their baby teeth and have their adult teeth start to come in. So you also see, some changes in their dental development as well. Very important aspect of health during this early childhood is immunizations, so getting the correct, proper schedule of immunizations. That starts in infancy, obviously, but it's going to continue throughout early childhood. So making sure the children are getting the proper vaccines is extremely important. Somewhere around 20% of preschoolers tend to lack the proper immunizations. And that's even for preschoolers who are eligible. Obviously, you have some who are maybe immunocompromised, can't get immunizations. But even of the ones who are physically eligible, there's about 20% who do not get the proper vaccinations. So it's important that obviously we keep those immunization numbers up and that they're getting that during that early childhood period. Okay, in addition to some of the overall body growth, we also continue to see, improvements and developments in the brain. There's increased localization happening of functionality. So again, something we kind of touched on last time, this idea that, different areas of the brain are responsible for different activities or different functions. And as you get older, that localization increases, which essentially makes the brain more efficient overall. So you get more of that localization. You also see lots of growth, particularly in the prefrontal cortex. Prefrontal cortex is really important for emotion regulation, some of the executive functions that we'll talk about in just a little bit. So you see growth, like new neurons forming, but also more connections between the neurons that already exist. You start to see more activity in the left hemisphere in particular. Left hemisphere is very important for language development. So again, that's another cognitive thing that we'll talk about in just a second. So just remember that some of those cognitive improvements are happening partially because of these changes that are happening in the brain. You also start to see more connectivity between the cortex and the areas I have listed here. Cerebellum is a part of the brain that's sort of it almost looks like a second brain that you have kind of at the base of your skull. And it is really important for like coordinated movement. So, as they're making advances in those gross motor skills, playing on the playground, running around, all those things, you're seeing more connections in the cerebellum that allows them to plan those movements, keep their balance, etc. The amygdala is another structure that becomes more connected to the cortex. Amygdala is really important for processing and regulating emotions. So again, we'll talk more about that in a second when we talk about some of that executive function. And the hippocampus, the third area I have listed here that becomes more connected to the cortex, is a structure that's mostly important for forming new memories. So the hippocampus is kind of this structure that's absorbing information throughout the day as you're learning. It's taking in that new information. So very important for memory development. And then that fourth point, there's this structure called the corpus callosum, which is this kind of web of neurons that connects the left and the right hemisphere to each other. And that thickens. So again, you have growth of new neurons, but also connections being made between pre-existing neurons. You also have some myelination of the corpus callosum. So remember, myelin is that like fatty stuff that wraps around the axons that helps speed it up. So the corpus callosum is also becoming quicker. Yeah. The left and the right hemisphere. Yeah, so you've got kind of the two different sides of the brain. The corpus callosum is one of the main structures that allows those two hemispheres to talk back and forth to each other. So you're getting this localization where it's like functionality is spreading out to the different parts of the brain, but then you're also getting more connection between those parts. So you have more synchronization of movement, better perception. Okay, so those are some of the physical developments, and all of these are going to support some of the cognitive developments that we're about to talk about next. So first, let's start with Piaget and his theory about the different stages that we go through in regards to cognitive development. So if you remember last time we talked about the first stage was sensory motor. So infants were mostly focusing on like just building, the ability to sense the world, to see, to hear, etc. And those motor movements, being able to just do very basic movements. Now, around this stage of 2 to 7, they're getting into this pre-operational stage. So some of the cognitive gains they make during this time are increases in what's called representational activity, which kind of relates to this idea of symbol relations and make-believe. So essentially, they're much better at sort of representing something real in an abstract way. So you can see this in their make-believe play. So they might see something like a movie, where there's an astronaut or whatever, and then they can make believe by pretending to be that astronaut or pretending to be a firefighter or whatever it might be. So kind of their activity, their play is representative of something real that they've seen in the world. And you can also see this in the development of their understanding of symbol relations. So this would be in regards to like language development. They're starting to understand that letters represent a sound and that words represent something that has meaning. Also in improvements with math as well. So they start to understand kind of the symbolic nature of numbers and doing arithmetic, etc. So you see lots of improvements in this representational activity. Some of the limitations we still see during this pre-operational stage. One is this concept called egocentrism, which is this idea that children in this stage often can only think kind of from their own perspective, and they have a very hard time putting themselves in another person's shoes and seeing from a different perspective. They also sometimes have a difficulty like distinguishing their own views from others. So if they believe something to be true or there's something that they like or prefer, then they just assume that everyone else does too. So if their favorite color is blue, they might assume everyone else's favorite color is blue. If they have a particular TV show they like, they're going to assume everyone else does too, because they lack that ability to like think from a different perspective. Yes, exactly. Yeah, like when they find out that someone thinks something different, they're often shocked and surprised and confused and like don't understand it. So this also contributes to things like sort of animalistic or magical thinking. So they might even apply that egocentrism to like animals or objects. So they might think that their pet's favorite color is blue or that the broom's favorite color is blue because they're applying that same sort of egocentrism even outside of people.
Or that the cat enjoys being carried.
Yes, yeah, which probably does not in my experience of cats at least. They also tend to have some other sort of like faults in their thinking. So one of them is this lack of conservation. So this has to do with their sort of grasp on like the physical properties of objects and materials. One of the ways that they test this idea of conservation is you can take like a tall, skinny glass and put some amount of liquid in that, and then have like a smaller, wider cup or whatever. And in front of them, if you pour this liquid into here and then ask them which one has more, they often will say that the taller one has more just because it's higher, right? So they lack that ability to understand that a material conserves its properties even if you move it to a different container. Kind of same idea if you take like a ball of Play-Doh and it's balled up, in a nice small little ball, and then you take the same ball and smash it out flat. They might say that the flat one has more because it's spread out over a bigger area. So they have a difficulty with that conservation. The other tests they often do kind of similar. You might have seen, I feel like I saw this on like TikTok or something recently, but they have like coins like this. Maybe they'll have 5 and they start out.
Oh, it was a YouTube video in the textbook.
Oh, yeah, that's probably where I saw it. But yeah, so they have like 2 rows of coins, and they take 1 row and spread them out. So now instead of being here, it's like this one's here, and this one's there, and then they ask them which one has more, and oftentimes they'll say this bottom row has more just because it's taking up more space. So they tend to lack that concept of like how the physical properties remain the same even if you change its appearance just a little bit.
Do we know like why that is? Like, is it a underdeveloped part of the brain? Like that isn't.
That's a good question.
They don't have the synapses.
Right. Yeah. I don't know for sure off the top of my head. I would guess like brain is still developing during this time. It's not fully developed by the end of early, just not even fully developed by like early 20s. So probably there's a neurological component to it. I would guess that their attention is on the wrong thing. So instead of counting and paying attention to that, they're paying attention to the way that it's spaced out on the board. And so they're not like tuning into the correct variables when they're making these decisions. But yeah, there's probably some neurological correlate to it, but I don't know off the top of my head. So, okay, they also struggle with things like hierarchical classification. So one example of this, they show them like a display that has a bunch of different flowers, and there's some blue flowers and some red flowers. And they ask them, is there more red flowers or is there more flowers? And oftentimes they struggle like making that shift from one level of hierarchy to the other. And so they will often say like, there's more of the red or whatever, like they'll give the wrong answer because they're not making that sort of transition from one stage of the hierarchy to the other. So they seem to kind of lack this concept that one set can contain multiple sets within it. So still, even though we're seeing some gains in representational activity, there's still some very obvious limitations to their understanding of some of these concepts. And I would maybe just emphasize, kind of to get to your point, like this is all very normal. This is the very normal levels of development. So if you interact with a 6-year-old and you have them do these tasks and they're showing these errors, that does not mean there's something wrong with that child. In fact, it means they're developing, completely normally. Okay, so stepping away from Piaget and looking at cognitive development just a little bit more broadly, we do see some gains in executive function and things like memory. So again, executive function encompasses kind of a lot of things. It would include our ability to self-regulate, which involves things like, regulating our emotions, being able to express our emotions in a way that's appropriate given the context or the situation. It's also our ability to think ahead, to set goals, to plan, and then to follow the steps to reach that goal. But overall, just our ability to kind of control ourselves. And then memory, it includes, there's lots of different types of memory, but they're making advances in pretty much all of those kinds of memory during this stage. So we see improvements kind of across the board in those areas. I'm just looking at my notes, seeing if I'm skipping anything important. One of the ways that they test memory, particularly like working memory, your ability to shift attention specifically, which is also another part of executive function, is through something called the Wisconsin card sorting task. I was about to ask you if you've ever heard of that. I can't imagine any reason that you would have. But Wisconsin card sorting task, basically there's this deck of cards, and the cards all have different like shapes on them. So sometimes they have like a star or whatever, and they might have like triangles, whatever, right? But each card will have shapes that are a different number, a different color, and a different shape, right? So you can imagine like there's one star, there might be a card that has 3 stars or whatever, and they're also different colors. And the game of the Wisconsin card sorting task, basically you have the deck sitting next to you with all these cards in them, and then there are 3 cards placed in front of the child. So you've got like just 3 random cards here or whatever. They've got the deck. They're supposed to take one from the deck and place it where they think it should go according to a rule that they don't know yet. So like the adult who's administering this has some rule in their head, like maybe you're supposed to sort by color, maybe you're supposed to sort by number, etc. So the child doesn't know this rule, but they're basically guessing with each card. They put it in one of the piles, and then the adult will say either yes or no. And so they do this task repeatedly to try to figure out what the rule is, basically. And so that's kind of testing their memory and other things. Another thing they'll do, though, is at some point, whenever the child has clearly learned the rule, so the adult is saying yes over and over again, it's clear they've figured it out, they're sorting it correctly, the adult will switch the rule without telling the child. And so then now they have to figure out that the rule has changed and that they need to shift their attention from whatever they were focused on before to now something different. And what we find is that early in this early development, like from like 2 to 5, they're really good at figuring out the first rule, but they have a hard time switching to that second rule. And then as you get towards the end of this early childhood, they get better at shifting that attention and kind of making the shift to the second rule. In addition to executive function and memory, they're also developing what's called theory of mind, which kind of relates to egocentrism. So theory of mind is this idea of understanding that other people have a different life, a different experience, a different way of thinking, and that your way of thinking is separate from that and different. So they're making improvements and developments in that. Let's see, I think I have an example of a study they do to test that as well. Yeah, so there's a test they do called the false belief task, where, I'm trying to remember the specific logistics of how they do this. So false belief task, they have 2 different boxes. One is labeled like Band-Aids, for example. So they have a box labeled Band-Aids, one with no label, and they close both of them so you can't see what's inside. And they ask the child, which one do you think the Band-Aids are in? And the child will usually say it's the one labeled Band-Aids, right? So then they'll open it up and show them, no, it's not actually in here. The Band-Aids is in the other one, okay? Then they will ask them, okay, we're going to bring in Sally, and we're going to show Sally the same thing, and we're going to ask Sally where she thinks the Band-Aids will be. What do you think Sally will say? Usually a child who hasn't developed theory of mind, they will say that Sally thinks the Band-Aids are in the unlabeled box. Because from their perspective, the kid has seen that it's in the unlabeled box, and they can't put themselves in like Sally's shoes to understand like Sally didn't see that. So she's going to arrive at the logical conclusion it's in the Band-Aid box, right? So they will say that she thinks it's in the unlabeled box. And then again, as they get towards the end of this, up to like 5, 6, 7, they get better at switching and realizing, okay, Sally didn't see where the Band-Aids actually are. She's going to come to the logical conclusion that it's in the Band-Aid box. So then they give the different answer sort of towards the end of early childhood. So we see improvements in developing that theory of mind, sort of moving away from that egocentrism as we get towards the end of early development. Some academic developments that they're making during this time relate to literacy and math. So they are becoming better at, towards the beginning of this, 2 to 3, they're mostly learning like phonemes and pairing those phonemes with different letters. And then as they get older, they're starting to, gain some ability to read simple words, etc. And then in addition, I thought I had stats on like what their vocabulary is, but I think I was thinking of last time because I talked about that. With math, they start out by sort of understanding like ordinality. So the idea that you have like ordered relationships between quantities, that 1 comes before 2, 2 comes before 3, etc. And then they're sort of building more complex mathematical understanding off of that. We see a lot of pretty large individual differences in academic development start to emerge during this time. A lot of those individual differences relate to things like socioeconomic status. So typically children who are being raised in higher wealth households tend to make advances in these areas more quickly compared to those who are in lower socioeconomic status households. Kind of as we talked about last time, exposure is very important. So the more that children have exposure to reading books, like their parents are reading to them, buying books for them, etc., then they will advance quicker than those who are not getting that exposure. Let's see, what else? That's all I've got for academic development. Okay, so let's move on to talk a little bit about language development. So one of the huge advances we see during this time is this really explosive growth in vocabulary. So I have my stats on that next one. So around 2, they have a vocabulary of about 250 words. By the time they get to the end of this early development, they have about 10,000 words in their vocabulary. So very huge growth. Part of this comes from this concept of fast mapping, which is where basically they become really good at kind of deducing through context what a word means, even if they've never been exposed to it. It's not like they have to go to a dictionary and look up the definition. It's just that they can see like, oh, I'm encountering this word I've never seen before. It's through context clues I can figure out it's referencing something. This is particularly, like they're good at this with tangible objects in the environment. So if they hear 2 people having a conversation about something that's like right there, like talking about dinner, and you're talking about the food that's right in front of you, if someone uses a word they've never heard before to refer to the broccoli or whatever, then they can quickly learn like, okay, the word broccoli is referring to this specific thing that's in front of me. So they do best at fast mapping with tangible things that they're exposed to, but they can also do it in more abstract ways through like context clues when they're reading. But that contributes a lot to that explosive growth in vocabulary. We also see improvements in their grammar, but they make very predictable mistakes during this early childhood period, especially during kind of the early parts of this from like 2 to 4. You see, for example, like over-regulation is an example where if they learn a grammatical rule, they will over-apply that to like every instance. Classic example, the ed at the end of a word usually is what we do to make it past tense. So you might hear a kid say like runned instead of ran because they're over applying that rule that they've learned to even cases where it doesn't apply. And their conversation ability also improves. So part of that is using vocabulary, using grammar, but they also get better at like taking turns in speech and understanding that a conversation is, where there's 2 people talking, one person says something, the other person responds. They start to understand that their responses should be relevant to the conversation instead of just whatever random thought pops into their head. So they become better at having conversations as they get towards the end of this early childhood. Some of the things that can help with language development, I already talked about reading, reading to your children frequently or having their parents read to them or whatever caregiver read to them is important. Also things that happen conversationally. So just engaging in conversation with the child in the first place is very beneficial. In that conversation, using what are called recasts and expansions. A recast is where if the child makes a mistake in the way they say something, then you repeat their sentence back in the correct way. So if the child said, oh, I runned to school yesterday, then you can repeat, oh, you ran to school yesterday, like repeat it back to them in the correct format, then they're able to learn to fix those mistakes that they're making. And then expansions is kind of similar to where they say something and then you repeat back what they said, but you add to it. You enrich whatever they just said, and that's helping to expose them to more vocabulary, helping with those conversation skills. And then just having rich conversations, so trying to talk to them about as many things as possible, as often as possible, will really help improve their language development more quickly. Okay. I don't have much to say about the role of technology in media because you all probably already know this. And I believe your discussion this week is based off of this as well. So, but yeah, so there's evidence that, increased screen time can impede a lot of the types of development we've talked about so far. So in regards to physical development, obviously the more time you spend sedentary staring at a screen, the less advances you're going to see in like those gross and fine motor skills we talked about at the beginning. But they can also impair some of these cognitive and academic developments that we just talked about as well. In general, the evidence shows that the more passive the media is, the worse the outcome will be. So, sitting around and just watching TV is probably the worst of all of the different types of media. You're going to be the most sedentary. You're not cognitively engaged with it. So that can be, the most damaging. And then the more engaging or interactive the media is, in general, is going to be better. There's obviously caveats to that. If the interactive media includes like violence or things, then that's probably not great. But in general, the more interactive, the better. So especially now, we're seeing more and more video games that incorporate physical activity, right? I mean, it started out with like Wii and stuff like that, but I would say it's improving to where we have more and more games that involve being active. We also have more and more games that are more engaging in a cognitive way, like you're using some sort of cognitive skill to advance through the game, like doing puzzles of some sort, typically will actually help some of those cognitive developments we talked about. And there's some evidence that, obviously like educational media can also provide benefits as well. Again, especially if it's something that's more interactive instead of just sitting and passively watching. In regards, I will say too, in regards to like violent media, there is pretty good evidence. Sometimes like mainstream media makes it sound like there's a debate or a controversy about whether violent media is bad or good or whatever. I would say the researchers in cognitive psychology have pretty much come to a consensus that the more you are exposed to violent video games and TV shows in childhood, the more likely you are to be aggressive later on. So there's a pretty clear consensus on that. There's all kinds of risk factors to whether someone will become aggressive or not, and media consumption is just one of those risk factors, but it is a risk factor. It does increase the chance that someone will engage in violent behavior later on, especially if they're exposed really early during this age range of like 2 to 7. Again, there'll be a little bit more on that in your discussion